part one of scoliosis, we talked about the story, a story that we just share in order to give us the overall context of what we're really trying to do here. In part two, we talked about the principles or truth of what we know about movement, what we know about the human body, what we know and what we don't know about scoliosis, and established the truth, the principles that we're going to build upon. We're going to start with the truth, develop strategies, and then ultimately reveal the techniques that we believe are our best efforts, our heart's desire at really controlling and maybe even treating and reversing scoliosis curves. In part three, we talked about the strategies, and the strategies, interestingly enough, were pretty easy to understand once we understand the truth. And once we understand the strategies, then we have to say, okay, now what do we need to know yet in order to then take advantage of the strategies to reveal the techniques? And what we still need to know is what we call part four, the curves. So with part four, I want to share with us the curves of scoliosis, but then start attaching those to the strategies so that when we go to work and we begin doing our programs based on creating the proper mobility and the proper stability and the proper endurance in order to allow the human body to deal with and inhibit, and as we even said, hope and pray, even in some cases correct a scoliosis curve, that we have a good contextual understanding, and so we can really make sure we can systematize this and to also individualize this. When we take a look at the curves, if we look at the back view of a human being, we see that we have two basic type curves. We have a C curve, which of course is named by the shape of the curve, and we have what's called an S curve, which again is named by the shape that the curve gives us. A C curve is mostly one curve, dominant. We see a little bit of compensation above and below, but nothing that all of a sudden takes off into another direction. And an S curve, by definition, is exactly that, a C curve that then takes off in another direction to give us a full S curve. And so if we take a look, of course, we can have a C curve that basically curves with an apex to the right. So if we're looking at the back head of somebody, so if you're looking at my back head and you're looking at my pelvis, which is this right here, I would have a C curve if I just had a simple C curve, and it would be a C curve to the right, apex to the right, if basically the curve here showed what we would actually call an opposite C. A true letter C would be a left, what we would call a left curve. That would simply be, I am more like this, my curve goes like that, my pelvis goes like that, so we can see kind of a compensation of the pelvis and what the head's doing, and we see that we have a C left curve of significance. And remember, let's go back to that. Scoliosis curves, and I think because of the path of least resistance principle, are type 1 curves. So if I have this particular C curve that goes this way, which we would call a right curve, we would see a rib hump on the right-hand side, which means the transverse plane compensation with the frontal plane compensation is basically the chest cavity rotating to the right with the actual lateral flexion of the curve being to the left. Now that's somewhat confusing. I'm kind of left, kind of laterally flexed, but that's really called a right curve because of the apex being right and the rotation is to the right. So a right curve, the convexity, the point here of the right, basically is a curve that literally has lateral flexion to the left and rotation to the right. Now, of course, the C curve with the apex to the left actually has lateral flexion to the right and obviously rotation to the left. Again, the type 1, which means opposite. Whatever the frontal plane's doing, the transverse plane compensates by doing the opposite. Now, what's intriguing and what I think is going to help us significantly is to understand that how we treat a C curve can't be exactly how we treat an S curve just because of obviously we now have two curves. A lot of the principles will hold true, And therefore, the strategies are going to have some similarities, but we have to understand what we're after utilizing those strategies. So now if we come to an S-curve, well, we have, let's say, the high curve, the apex is to the right, and the low curve, the apex is to the left. That obviously is a S-curve that's made up of two C-curves. It's made up of a right apex C-curve and a left apex C-curve. That's going to be significant to us in just a second. The other S-curve, obviously, that we can have is the higher curve is the apex is to the left, and the lower curve, the apex is to the right. Now again, as you go down lower, we don't have ribs, and therefore we actually see more of a soft tissue, kind of erector spiny transverse process hump on this side. When we have our lateral flexion of the lower spine to the left, we have that resultant rotation to the right, and so we see a huge thickness here, where up here on the left-hand side of the thoracic spine, because I'm laterally flexed to the right, I have that left apex curve. All of a sudden I see the rotation basically to the left. So if we can appreciate that we have C curves and we have S curves, our first strategy that will reveal our techniques is going to attack C curves. However, we should then realize that, wait a minute, based on how we attack the C curve, we are going to use very similar strategies to attack the S curve, understanding that in reality it's two C curves. Let's see if I can make some sense out of that. So let's first of all attack a C curve. Again, this is the back part of the head, and this down here is the pelvis. And we have a spine that should be nice and straight, but we have a spine that's not, that actually takes off to the right and then comes back home and then finally finds the pelvis. And so we have, as you can see here, if you just simply say, well, what happened here? You'd say, well, it looks like it kind of took off to the right, then came back to the left. Oh, this whole thing is laterally flexed to the left. So it's laterally flexed left, and we know that with that, we also have the associated rib hump on the right-hand side, the right apex curve, and so we're rotated to the right. So we have a right apex C curve, lateral flexion of this spinal column to the left with rotation to the right. And so we have to take a look at that and say, so what are we going to consider? What are we going to do about that? Well, one of the things we can consider is understanding that turning this person 90 degrees, we also are going to have a curve in what we call the sagittal plane. So we have a 3D situation going on here. Now, again, knowing that this is a neurological problem, it's a muscular problem, it's a skeletal problem, we have to say from a very subconscious standpoint, how are we going to influence this curve in 3D? And what will our strategies be, knowing that we're going to also take advantage of gravity, top down, and ground reaction force bottom up, and massive momentum of the body just moving the way the body normally moves. One huge strategy we're going to do is we're going to say we're going to influence this curve what we call top down. And so we're going to say what in the body, in addition to gravity, will influence this curve top down. And the answer is quite simple. It's the drivers that we normally use in real life. So if I basically have rotation to the right here, and you all of a sudden want to see, well, can you rotate further right? You can have me do one of two things top down. You can have me rotate my eyes, just have me look across my right shoulder, and all of a sudden you see more rotation. Or you could say, take your right hand and move it here. You got more right rotation. Or take your left hand and move it here. Again, we have more right rotation. So we know we can enhance this rotation by what our eyes do. So we got an eye driver. And by what our hands do. So we have a right and left hand driver that we can utilize in order to facilitate the chain reaction motion that we want top down. Now bottom up, it's as simple. So bottom up, we look at the pelvis and we say, well, pelvis, if you could do something to that spine to influence the rotation or to influence the lateral flexion or to influence the sagittal plane motion, the pelvis would say, well, I can do that. In other words, relatively speaking, the right rotation, my pelvis can give me more right rotation if my pelvis itself moves to the left. You can kind of see that. So if I take a step with my right foot forward and keep everything else the same, and now I come back home, you can see now I'm hugely rotated to the right. So moving the pelvis forward to the left increases that right rotation, and I can do that by bringing my right foot forward or bringing my left foot back. And so we can see, whoa, wait a minute, using the feet, which are common drivers of the human body, is a wonderful way to do what we call a bottom-up strategy. So our bottom-up strategy, in addition to using ground reaction force, we're going to use our feet as drivers in order to influence the pelvis, and the pelvis, therefore, will talk to the spine, and it'll start to influence what happens to this spine bottom up. We have to realize that we not only need to take advantage of gravity top down, ground reaction force bottom up, and mass and momentum through the entire body, but we have to say what drivers are authentic to the body that we can utilize to teach the proprioceptors and the muscles and the bones what we want them to do. And the answer is top down, we'll use our eyes and our hands, and bottom up, we'll use our feet in order to create the motion that we want to create. Now, what's nice about that is this works beautifully, because once we figure out the strategies for this right apex curve, then all we're going to need to do is kind of do the mirror image in our mind's eye for mobility, and which is going to be different than stability, which is going to be a little bit different than from endurance. We're going to simply say, let's just flip it, and therefore whatever our eyes and our hands are doing to create the mobility or to create the stability with this right apex curve, obviously we're going to do just the opposite with the left apex curve. When we deal with the bottom-up strategy, the same thing. We'll come up with a strategy that we're going to utilize with our feet and with our lower extremities in order to create a reaction of this spine, create the chain reaction that we desire, create a new path, so to speak, in order to create the sagittal plane, and more importantly, the frontal plane, and maybe even more importantly, the transverse plane motion, by taking advantage of what our feet do to move the pelvis in order to move the spine. Whatever we do with this right apex curve, if somebody presents with a left apex C curve, with their lateral flexion is to the right and rotation to the left, we're going to simply say, hey, whatever we just talked about doing to make the pelvis move by getting the feet to move, we're going to do the mirror image or just the opposite. So we're going to go, hey, that's going to be quite good for us to be able to understand that in order to comprehensively take advantage of that C curve. Now, it goes a step further, and it goes to the S curve. So the S curve, of course, is a C curve compensated by a C curve. Again, we have our pelvis, and we have the back of our head here. We have the rotation to the right here. We have the rotation to the left here. So it makes sense to us, just kind of a logic or a biomechanical sense, that we need to treat both of these curves at the same time. If we choose one curve over the other curve is going to say, well, when you try to manipulate me, I'm just going to use my compensatory curve to compensate anyway, so I have a bailout. So we have to be way ahead of the game and say, we can't allow a bailout if we're going to create a new path. Right now, that spine says, the path I choose is not ideal. I go here, and then I go here, and I am whopper-jawed. And not only have I whopper-jawed in the frontal plane, but I'm whopper-jawed in the transverse plane. If you only attack one curve, as you do that, whether you attack it from the top down or bottom up, or outside in or inside out, the curve's going to say, if you don't concurrently understand what's happening to the other curve, I will use the other curve to compensate, and in fact, you may be wasting some time. So it adds a little bit of what we would call strategic dilemma. Well, I think it becomes quite simple again if we look at it from a logical standpoint. This curve we're going to treat top down. This curve we're going to treat bottom up. Makes sense. And obviously, as we treat this curve top down and this curve bottom up, we're going to be really interested in what happens where these two curves come together. Now, from a top down, if we already know a strategy that we're going to use for a right apex C curve, which is laterally flexed to the left and rotated to the right, we're going to use that same top-down strategy for this part of this S-curve. If we then say, well, now I have a C-curve here as part of the S-curve, with the apex to the left, we're going to come back over here and go, wait a minute, all we got to do is flip this right apex curve, and now we have this curve, which is a left apex curve. Whatever we did with the pelvis here and the lower extremities bottom up, we're going to simply flip that, mirror image that for this particular curve, which is this curve here. So we're going to have the strategy of the C curve, the top C curve, utilizing the strategy top down that we'll do for a right apex C curve, and we'll utilize the strategy of a bottom up left C curve, well, what we're going to do with the lower extremities and obviously the pelvis. And again, important to understand this, all three planes of motion, when we go about our mobility techniques, and then of course when we go about our stability techniques, and of course our endurance techniques. Right now, we want to appreciate that we have a C curve or an S curve. They can go one way or they can go the other. If we're going to attack them, we have to attack them understanding the truths of applied functional science, and therefore we're going to attack a C curve from the top down and bottom up with strategies of mobility and stability and endurance. And then if we have an S curve, we're going to simply say, well, we'll look at the C curve from the top and we'll attack that top down, and we'll look at the compensatory C curve from the bottom and we'll attack that appropriately bottom up, making sure that they can't kind of have a bailout system. We're actually controlling both. Scoliosis is the body seeking to just simply be successful. And for some reason or another, it has sought a curvature that's not ideal, we believe, for human function. And therefore, it has followed a path, just like a river, a path of least resistance. If we're going to truly give that scoliosis an opportunity to understand that that's not the path we want it to take or to continue to take, to progress, that we need to develop a new path, we have to develop a new river, so to speak, for the body to subconsciously go to. Therefore, we have to outthink why it's doing what it's doing, and we have to be very smart enough to use drivers of authentic human function in order to facilitate a new path. And more importantly, we got to give the body the need and the desire to follow the new path, and we got to give it its resources to follow the new path. And as we develop this, and as we go and we look closely at our C-curve mobility in part 5, we're going to realize that we're in control of the entire body, the entire chain reaction, and therefore we're going to create a new path, a new mobility path, carve out something new to say this is kind of where you have freedom now to go, but then we have to give the water a reason to go down that new path and give it the power that it needs to say, hey, this path is better. I have the ability, the stability to stay in this path, and I have the endurance in order to endure and stay in this path throughout the entire day. Again, we're going to have to use all of our resources, all of our understanding of applied functional science, all of our strategies, and put all our techniques together into a wise approach, hopefully an approach based on beauty and an approach based on wisdom, in order to give this human body, to give this spine, to give this beautiful individual an opportunity to function the best they can function and ultimately get back the spine that they need in order to create the core that they need to create the body they need to literally enjoy life.